Hi everyone, I'm Life Peng, and this is episode 5 of Looking Through Old Magazines. Today, the April 1972 issue of Good Housekeeping magazine. Let's take a look inside. So the first thing I want to do as we open this issue of Good Housekeeping is take a look at the masthead, because I'm not really familiar with this art director, Bernard Springsteel, or at least I wasn't at all familiar with him until I did a bit of Googling. And it turns out he was not just the art director of Good Housekeeping, it didn't say for how long, but also the art director at McCall's magazine. So pretty high profile. Like, those were two gigantic magazines. I mean, maybe they still are in a sense. And a person like this, to be the art director of such a huge, successful, millions of issues per month kind of magazine, would mean that this was a very big dog art director, Bernard Springsteel. If you ever saw that movie, The Devil Wears Prada, he would sort of be like the Stanley Tucci character was in that movie, which means he probably had staff. And if you look a little further down, sure enough, here it says art, Herb Leibowitz, Joel Siegel Associates, Elizabeth Mistress, Catherine Surin Assistants, and then art production. Those would be the people who, do a lot of this, like setting type and so on, and placing images and everything, placing the ads. But anyway, the reason I want to mention those other people, the assistants, the associates, and so on, is that Bernard Springsteel, although he would have been sort of like the artistic visionary for the look of Good Housekeeping during these years, these other people definitely would have had a say in who got hired in terms of illustrators and photographers. More likely for like the minor stuff, not like the major stuff. So the other thing I learned about Bernard Springsteel is he was also an artist. He even published a couple of books on watercolor painting and so on later in his life, which is a good sign, right? Because being an artist, he probably had a real appreciation for illustration, and that would explain why there's so much great illustration in Good Housekeeping during all these years. He was no doubt making a lot of those choices for the magazine. Okay, so let's see what's in here. There's some minor stuff here, and some little sort of relatively nondescript little illustrations here and there. Oh, here's actually a full page illustrated ad, which is, to be honest, not great, but kind of a good sign for 1972 that anybody in advertising was considering, using an illustrator rather than a photographer. You can see once again that almost every ad is a photo ad. So not too likely we're going to see a whole lot of prominent illustration, relatively speaking. There's another little funny thing. I wonder what else is in here a little further along. Let's keep going. Right near the front of this issue of Good Housekeeping is an advertising illustration by Susan Pearl. Pearl's a really interesting case because, unlike so many artists of the time, she actually didn't have any formal training. She came from Vienna with her family as a young woman, and got a job at Vogue magazine as a staff illustrator, and then for the next 10 years, she learned on the job, and then eventually became a very famous and successful magazine and book illustrator. One of the first actual story illustrations in this issue of Good Housekeeping is by Marvin Friedman, who's someone that I actually got to know a little bit over the years. Marvin and I used to correspond and had a few conversations on the phone. And I just really admire him both as a person and as an artist. When you look at his work, it might seem kind of crude in its execution, and that was a very deliberate thing on his part. Marvin developed this style that has a kind of immediacy to it, almost like a reportage kind of quality to it, that was very, very popular. It worked really well for him for quite a long time. And I'll be doing a whole video on Marvin sometime soon, because he was one very interesting cat, and I would love to share more of his work and some stories. Here's the first really major fully painted illustration in this particular issue of Good Housekeeping, and it's by Joe Bowler. And Joe was incredibly popular with the art director at Good Housekeeping during these years. And this is just another beautiful example of his tremendous skill. This is just a wonderful piece. And it comes with a small spot up here in the top corner. So it's actually two illustrations on one spread, and they're both absolutely beautiful. Okay, so this is a big treat. You see that name right there, Amsel? That means this illustration is by Richard Amsel, who was definitely one of the sort of biggest, most prominent, most influential illustrators of the 70s. Amsel started his professional career actually doing some album covers. I think it was Barry Manilow saw his work and then introduced him to Barbra Streisand and eventually also Bette Midler. So those are, musical artists who were like massive at the time. And he did covers for their albums. And then did a lot of movie posters for some very famous movies like Chinatown, The Last Picture Show, Murder on the Orient Express, and The Muppet Movie, among others. And did a ton of TV guide covers as well, something like 40. He also did a cover for Time magazine, I think more than one actually, but the one he did of Lily Tomlin is now in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution. So very, very high profile artist, Richard Amsel. And then next up is a real surprise. This is an illustration by a UK illustrator named Brian Sanders. And I had the really good fortune to get to know Brian, or Sandy, as he's called by his friends, through a mutual friend who was actually one of his art directors back in the 60s, Bryn Havard. Bryn wrote several guest pieces about Sandy for my blog, Today's Inspiration, and they're definitely worth checking out because Sandy's artwork is beautiful, and a real treat to read all about his career, including, for those of you who are fans of the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, there's some awesome sort of inspirational paintings that Kubrick hired Sandy to do for that movie that are definitely worth checking out. And I'll put the link to that work in the description below the video. But one of the coolest things of all was that Sandy, after many years of pretty much being retired, was kind of rediscovered by the producers of the TV show Mad Men. And they ended up hiring him to do a promotional poster for, I think it was season 6, which I will make sure to find a link to as well. And it was very, very gratifying to have his story on Today's Inspiration, because when the New York Times wrote about that poster and Sandy, you know, coming back from the Mad Men era to create it. They included links to my blog, Today's Inspiration, so you could see more of his work and read his story. So very cool to see his work in this issue of Good Housekeeping in 1972, meaning he wasn't just working in the UK, he was also getting work in North America. And remember at the beginning, we were looking at the masthead, and I was talking about some of those associates and assistant art directors. And I have a feeling this is where they had the opportunity to kind of choose who might illustrate some of these sort of minor features. You know, we looked at the major features in the middle of the magazine. Now we're getting to the back of the magazine, and here's this little illustration. I'm going to show you a few, and this is what I really want you to notice, is that this one is by Susan Gray, whom I've never heard of. And then another little one here. It's repeated. And then check this out. This one is by Elsie Jane McCorkle, who I think I've heard of, but I probably only have ever seen minor illustrations like these by her. But nevertheless, there she is in Good Housekeeping. And there's some more. And then look at this. Catherine Martin. So on those pages, all of a sudden, mind you, they are sort of the minor backup features, a whole bunch of illustrations by female illustrators specifically. And this is something that I've noticed throughout the years of looking at Good Housekeeping magazine, is there were quite a lot of female illustrators working in New York. We assume they're in New York, I guess, because back then you lived close to where you worked. And they were getting pretty steady work. It wasn't necessarily the highest profile stuff like the, you know, the major illustrations we looked at back here in the main part of the magazine. But nevertheless, I'm very interested in finding out more about that. Well, here we are, almost at the very back of this issue of Good Housekeeping. And what do you know? Here's another full page, full color illustration by Susan Pearl. And unsurprisingly, it's of children, which was her specialty. Pearl had a years-long relationship with this particular company, Health Techs. They made clothing for children, and they obviously really loved her work because she did so many of these ads that appeared in women's magazines, mostly women's magazines, during the late 60s and early 70s. And sort of a sideline of my research that I've been doing over the years into the illustrators of the mid-20th century. I actually have another blog that's specifically called that, Female Illustrators of the Mid-20th Century, and I can put a link to that too. And here is a fashion illustration by Joanne Landis. So again, women tended to more often get jobs in fashion illustration than in advertising. Not to say that there weren't any, and we'll definitely be looking at some of the women who were very successful in advertising and major story illustration. And then back at the back here is another minor feature, which I thought, you know, this might be some work by Amsel. It kind of has a little bit of the same kind of flair as his work. It's a little bit of the, I could almost imagine this as the sort of line art stylized version of his fully rendered full color work. But I'm just guessing it could be a lot of people. I mean, there's no credit for any of these illustrations, so who knows. But they're quite nice, and certainly very much of the time. They have a little bit of that almost like post-Flower Power kind of look to them, you know? Like Flower Power was starting to fade out, but it was still, you know, on its last legs in the early 70s. There you go. After that, there's really not much that I can recall. Bits and pieces, but nothing Nothing worth noting. And then we get to the end. Well, thanks for joining me today for another episode of Looking Through Old Magazine. I hope you enjoyed that April 72 issue of Good Housekeeping. If you like this video, please click the thumbs up button down there. And also, if you want to subscribe to this channel, that'd be awesome. And I hope I'll see you again next time. Bye for now.